the laughter around the table felt rehearsed, like a scene from a play I was never meant to be in. My hands trembled beneath the linen as I stared at the boy I'd raised. The boy who now looked right through me. His smile was polished, his words careful, his pride built on the ashes of everything I gave up. If you've ever loved someone so much it blinded you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Because love without respect isn't love at all. It's quiet decay. The truth that night didn't explode. It unfolded, soft but unstoppable. I had no idea then what it would cost me. I can still hear the clinking of silverware, the soft hum of conversation, and the scent of roasted garlic drifting through that room. Everything about that dinner was polished. The glassware, the tablecloth, the guests, everything except the way I felt inside. My hands trembled beneath the table, not from fear, but from something deeper. The slow ache of realization that love can turn into humiliation when pride takes its place. It happened in a heartbeat. One careless remark, spoken loud enough for the table to hear, cut through the laughter like a knife. I felt my face burn, though I forced a small smile. I had been embarrassed before. Life does that to you, but never by someone I loved more than myself. In that moment, it wasn't just a son showing off. It was a man trying to erase where he came from. I remember lifting my eyes and meeting his, the same blue eyes I once saw crying after his first heartbreak, the same boy I had carried on my hip when his legs were too tired to walk. I wanted to scream, to remind him of every night I stayed awake worrying, every bill I worked extra hours to pay. But instead, I stayed calm. My silence wasn't weakness, it was power. And when I finally spoke, my words were soft, almost kind, but they changed the air in that room. Every sound stopped, every fork froze mid-air. He didn't know it yet, but I was done hiding. That moment wasn't just a confrontation. It was the breaking point of a story that began years earlier, a story about sacrifice, shame, and a mother's love stretched too thin. Let me take you back to how we got here. Back then, life wasn't easy, but we had each other. I can still picture that small apartment, the peeling paint on the kitchen walls, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the second-hand sofa that doubled as my bed for years. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Every corner carried traces of love, mismatched dishes, laughter echoing off bare walls, the smell of instant noodles and hope. After Evan's father left, I didn't have time to cry. I had a son who needed me, and that was reason enough to keep moving. Mornings started before sunrise. I'd pack his lunch, tie his shoes, and kiss his forehead before rushing off to my first shift at the diner. By the time I came home from my second job, it would be past 10, and he'd be asleep on the couch waiting for me, a blanket barely covering his legs. Those moments, watching him sleep, gave me strength. We didn't have much money, but we had a rhythm, a quiet partnership built on love and understanding. Evan never complained. When I brought home leftover pie from the restaurant, his eyes would light up like it was Christmas. He used to tell me I was the strongest person he knew, and in those moments, I almost believed it. Every struggle felt worth it the day he got into college. I remember standing by the bus that would take him to the city, my heart swelling with pride. He hugged me tight and promised he'd make me proud. I watched him disappear down that road, feeling like all those years of exhaustion, all those late nights, had finally meant something. I truly believed I'd done it, that I'd raised a man who understood sacrifice, who knew the value of hard work and love. But I was wrong. When Evan first moved to New York City, I felt an overwhelming mix of pride and emptiness. Watching him step into that new life, the one I had dreamed of for him, filled me with joy. But it also left a quiet ache I couldn't shake. My days suddenly felt too long, my evenings too quiet. I used to count the hours until he called. At first, he did, almost every night. He'd tell me about his new job, the fast pace of the city, the little apartment he was proud to afford. I could hear excitement in his voice, and I told myself this was everything I'd worked for. But slowly, the rhythm changed. The calls came less often, and when they did, they were rushed, distracted. I'd ask about his day, and he'd give short answers, already half somewhere else. When I tried to visit, he hesitated, making excuses about work or his schedule. I told myself it was just a busy time, that he'd find balance soon. But deep down, I felt something shifting, a quiet wall rising between us. When I finally went to see him, I noticed how carefully he'd arranged his new world. Everything looked perfect. The furniture, the clothes, even the friends he introduced me to. But I didn't belong there. I saw it in the way his eyes flickered nervously when I spoke about home, or when I mentioned the old diner where I used to work. The moment that truly broke me came one afternoon when we were walking near his office. He turned to me, his voice low, and said I shouldn't talk about those hard years in front of anyone, that it might make people uncomfortable. It wasn't anger I felt then. It was something quieter, heavier, a hollow sadness that spread through my chest. I went home after that visit and sat alone in the kitchen for hours, staring at the empty chair across from me. I told myself he didn't mean it, that maybe he was just trying to fit in, that the city changed people. I tried to protect him in my mind the way I always had, convincing myself that he was still my boy underneath the ambition and polished words. But the truth was harder to face. The little boy who once held my hand through crowded streets now looked for ways to hide who we were. And for the first time, I felt like I had truly lost him, not to distance, but to shame. I didn't know it then, but that quiet heartbreak was only the beginning. His new world had more surprises waiting for me, ones that would test the limits of love, pride, and forgiveness. When Evan called to tell me he was getting engaged, I remember pressing the phone to my ear and feeling my heart swell and sink at the same time. He sounded happy, genuinely happy, and that was all I had ever wanted for him. But underneath the joy, there was a strange edge in his voice, like excitement laced with tension. I told him how proud I was, how much I couldn't wait to meet the woman who had captured his heart. And yet, when the call ended, I sat for a long time staring at the silent phone, wondering why I suddenly felt like a guest in my own son's life. Her name was Lena, beautiful, graceful, with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having to worry about money. Her family lived in an immaculate home with white columns, glass chandeliers, and a view that seemed to stretch forever. When I first met them, I wore my best dress, the navy one I'd saved for church and special occasions. I thought it would be enough. But the moment I walked in, I felt small, Their smiles were polite, their compliments soft and rehearsed. Everything from the way they sipped their wine to the way they spoke made me feel like I'd stepped into a world that wasn't meant for me. Evan tried to smooth things over. He stayed close to me that evening, but not out of affection, out of anxiety. Later, he gently suggested I might want to tone down the way I talked about our past, that maybe I shouldn't mention the years I worked double shifts or the time our car broke down and we walked home together in the rain. I knew he meant well, but his words hit me harder than I let him see. It wasn't advice, it was a warning, a quiet request to be invisible. I smiled through it. I told myself it was his nerves, that he wanted to make a good impression, that this was what love made people do. They tried to be better, but that night, as I hung my dress back in the closet, I felt something crack inside me. Pride and pain have a way of sharing space in a mother's heart. You learn to carry both. When the invitation came for the engagement dinner, I almost said no. But then I thought about all those years of sacrifice, all the nights I stayed awake hoping he'd find happiness. I told myself one evening of discomfort was nothing compared to everything I'd already endured. So I pressed my dress, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to walk into that room, unaware that the truth I'd kept buried for years was about to surface in front of everyone. It happened on a gray afternoon, the kind of day when even the sky feels tired. Evan called, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and pride. He said he'd made some bad business decisions, that he just needed help for a little while. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. When your child is in trouble, the instinct to protect overrides reason. He mentioned a number, $5,000, and it echoed in my mind like a bell I couldn't silence. That night, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by bills and memories. The house felt smaller than ever, the ticking clock louder. I looked around at everything I had built. The faded curtains, the chipped dishes, the photographs of a boy who once thought I could fix anything. I made my decision quietly. I mortgaged the house, sold the old car, and took out a loan from a friend who didn't ask too many questions. Every signature felt like a cut, but I told myself it was worth it. I told myself I was saving his future. The first payment cleared just before Christmas. I remember standing in line at the bank, the air outside sharp and cold, my fingers numb from the wind. People rushed past me carrying shopping bags, their laughter spilling into the street. I thought about how different my holidays had become. No tree that year, no gifts, just a sense of relief that my son's reputation was safe. Months turned into years. The debts didn't go away as easily as his promises. I skipped doctor visits, watered down soup to make it last, and worked overtime cleaning offices after hours. There were nights I'd come home so exhausted that I'd fall asleep still wearing my coat. But I never told him. Whenever he called, I'd pretend everything was fine, because mothers do that. We shield our children from the weight of our sacrifices. Then one day, I saw a photo of him online, smiling beside Lena at a gala, dressed in a tuxedo, champagne in hand. The caption read, "A rising star in finance." I stared at that image for a long time, wondering if he ever thought about where that smile came from, what it had cost. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't protecting him anymore. I was protecting a version of him that no longer existed, one who still knew the meaning of gratitude and love. Tomorrow night, at that engagement dinner. I will sit across from my son and his new world, and for the first time in years, I won't hide the truth. The dining room shimmered with the kind of perfection that money buys. Crystal glasses aligned in flawless symmetry, silver cutlery gleaming beneath the chandelier, and conversations wrapped in laughter that never reached the eyes. I sat at the far end of the long table, beneath a painting I didn't understand, wearing the same navy dress that had seen too many attempts at belonging. The air was perfumed with truffle oil and polite tension. Evan sat across from me, his hand resting on Lena's. He looked sharp, confident, every inch the man he wanted the world to see. Around him, her family laughed softly, their voices smooth and practiced. For a while, I let myself fade into the background, smiling when expected, nodding at stories I didn't follow. I had promised myself I wouldn't embarrass him. But then, I heard it, a story he told with ease, as if it were the truth. He spoke about growing up in comfort, about how his parents had always invested in his future, about old family values. My heart clenched. Each word erased a piece of the life we'd lived. The long nights, the hunger, the sacrifices I'd made so he could wear the face of success. I felt my hands tremble under the tablecloth, the linen soft against skin that had scrubbed too many floors. When Lena's mother turned to me, asking about those wonderful years, I felt the room tighten. Evan interrupted before I could speak. He brushed it off with a laugh, saying I didn't really understand that world, and then, almost too casually, he added that I wasn't exactly the same kind of woman his fiancée's mother was. The table went silent for a moment, just long enough for me to feel the weight of humiliation settle across my shoulders like a heavy shawl. I looked at my son, then really looked at him. I saw not the boy who once cried in my arms, but the man who had learned to build himself on the ruins of my love. And for the first time, I felt something stronger than shame. I felt clarity. I set my fork down and folded my hands. The noise of the room softened, the clinking glasses, the murmur of confusion, until it was just my voice filling the air. I spoke quietly, like someone reciting a truth too old to hide. I told them about the years of work, about the house I mortgaged, the money I borrowed, the meals I skipped. I told them that the world Evan lived in had been built on sacrifices he'd long chosen to forget. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every word fell heavy, deliberate, a confession wrapped in dignity. When I finished, no one moved. The laughter had vanished, replaced by a silence that felt holy in its honesty. Evan's face was pale. Lena's hand had slipped from his. I stood, smoothed my dress, and thanked them for the meal. Then I turned and walked out. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to let the air behind me close like a curtain. Outside, the night was cold and sharp. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching the lights of that house shimmer through the windshield. My hands were steady now. For years, I had carried the weight of silence, convinced it was love. But as I drove away, the burden began to lift, replaced by something quieter and purer, freedom. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe regret, maybe peace. But for the first time in a long time, I felt whole again. Not as Evan's mother, not as the woman who had hidden her pain, but as myself. The morning after the dinner, the house was quieter than I'd ever known it to be. Even the air seemed to move differently, slower, heavier. The curtains were still drawn. The clock on the wall ticked in its steady rhythm, and the smell of last night's rain lingered faintly through the open window. I sat at the kitchen table where I had once planned budgets and paid bills, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. The silence wasn't peaceful yet. It was the kind that comes after a storm, heavy with debris, waiting for someone to start picking up the pieces. For days, I didn't go anywhere. The phone stayed still on the counter, untouched. I told myself I didn't expect him to call, but the truth was, I did. Every creak in the floorboards, every car slowing down outside made my heart lift for a moment before falling again. I replayed the dinner in my mind, the look on his face, the shock in the room, the words I had spoken after years of silence. I wondered if I had done the right thing. I wondered if truth, when spoken too late, does more harm than good. But slowly, guilt began to dissolve into something softer, acceptance. I realized I hadn't spoken to destroy him. I had spoken to save myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in someone else's shadow or lie. The house felt different now, still quiet, but lighter somehow. One afternoon, there was a knock on the door. I knew that rhythm, hesitant, familiar, full of memory. When I opened it, Evan stood there, his shoulders lower than I'd ever seen them. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that comes from realizing too much too late. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His voice trembled when he finally spoke, and I could feel the apology in every word that didn't need to be said. I wanted to stay angry, to protect myself from disappointment. But as I looked at him, the man he had become, the boy he once was, I felt something shift inside me. Forgiveness didn't come like a rush. It came like a slow breath, fragile but real. I realized that forgiving him wasn't about excusing the past. It was about letting go of the pain that had kept me from breathing freely. After he left, I stepped outside for the first time in weeks. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of wet earth. I knelt by the garden that had long been neglected and began pulling at the weeds, clearing the space for something new. My hands sank into the soil, cool and alive. For a moment, I just breathed, really breathed, feeling the warmth of the sun on my back. Somewhere inside me, something had settled. The noise, the shame, the ache, all quieter now. Maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about remembering differently. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories. Months have passed since that night, and sometimes, when the sun pours through the kitchen window, I think about how much has changed, not just between my son and me, but within myself. The silence between us is no longer painful. It's thoughtful, filled with understanding. We speak less often, but when we do, there's honesty now. And that, to me, is worth more than the illusion of closeness built on lies. I used to believe that love meant giving everything: time, money, even pieces of myself I couldn't afford to lose. But I've learned that love without self-respect isn't love at all. It's surrender. The truth may have broken something that night, but it also set both of us free. My son learned humility. I learned boundaries. And maybe that's what growth really is. Not forgetting what hurt us, but letting it guide us towards something truer. I've stopped asking why things happened the way they did. Life has its own rhythm, a mix of heartbreak and grace. What matters is that we find meaning in both. If there's one thing I hope others take from my story, it's this: silence can protect, but it can also imprison. Sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is speak, not out of anger, but out of love for themselves. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of it felt familiar, know that you're not alone. We've all carried invisible weights, stayed quiet when our hearts begged us to speak. Share your thoughts, your own lessons, in the comments. Maybe together, we can remind each other that truth, no matter how heavy, is always the beginning of healing.